questions. Back in 2008, Vicki came, in our first living history tour, my jaw just dropped, and Vicki and the other three speakers was great, bringing things to life. As you came in here, you passed a copy of a document written in 1665 called Eastchester Covenant. In very simple language, the Puritans who founded this community said that the people would be compassionate, generous, and honest. And all four of these women have all of those traits. Robert is going to soon talk about his mother, but Bob, you grew up right near the Dusenberry estate. Do you want to share some of your memories of Amy?
Sure. Well, I think she was very warmly and properly portrayed. But I have to say that I know a seamier side of Miss Amy, and I feel obliged to tell you that. I was a kid who grew up in Bronxville. Our family moved here in 1937. And Miss Amy had a cow that she maintained, notwithstanding the village ordinances, right straight through the 30s and the Second World War. And my parents, both of whom who had grown up on farms out west, had no trouble with unpasteurized milk. So I was sent up to the old Masterton place 3 times a week with a tin bucket to collect 2 quarts of milk. And one time I went up there and I never got invited in the house. I always went down into the basement where the dairy was. But Miss Amy was outside of the house, and she was by herself, and she said, "Please come with me to the croquet course." Now she had on the north side of the house, they had a beautiful garden, but in the middle of their garden they had a croquet course. And I remember playing croquet with her for lack, she couldn't find anybody who was an adult and a responsible person. So the two of us played, but what I recall so clearly, because I saw her do it twice, I did not have the courage to call her, but she moved the ball. You know, it's interesting, that memory stayed with me because I actually got to know her a bit more as I grew up. She had incredible talents. One of her talents was she was an evangelist in her own way. And she ran a Sunday school course at the Bronxville Reformed Church for junior boys and senior boys. So we're talking about boys 16 and 17 years old. And I remember those Sundays. She, I think, really alone, I can't think of any other Sunday school teacher or perhaps any teacher was able to maintain discipline among intransigent boys as nobody else had done. She was a real leader in so many ways. And her history of public welfare sort of segues into my mother's own history. Mother, like some of the other women who were dramatized tonight, was not born in Eastchester. She was born in a little town in western Nebraska in 1907. Her father, German-Swiss, homesteaded out there, proved out on land. And he did very, very well out there. Not really as a homesteader, but he started a general delivery store, became a banker, and of course, times are so hard out there that the homesteaders frequently just gave up and left the property with the local bank, and in that case it was my mother's father. But he developed an eye disease, macular degeneration, became totally blind, and he decided to leave Nebraska, and he moved his whole family, the wife and 4 daughters, including my mother, to Colorado, who went to the university there and then to Bryn Mawr, where she got her degree in social work. And she came then to the city of Mount Vernon, which is, you've been told by Richard tonight, was once part of Eastchester, and in 1930, and secured employment with the Westchester Department of Social Work, and worked for that department for 15 years through 1945. And Eastchester was very much on her mind. She had responsibility for several of the impoverished single parents with children and the care of those children. And I can remember being invited up there as a kid to meet 2 of those families. In any event, though, her real history and connection with Bronxville and Eastchester, I think, in terms of continuance, is the story of her house. Mother and Dad bought that house, which we call the Abijah Morgan House, in 1937 from a bank. I've never really seen the hard statistics, but I know that the son of a former mayor of the village said that in the 30s, over half of the residential properties in Bronxville were owned by banks. Anyway, my parents bought that house for $12,000. It's on the corner of Pondfield and White Plains Road, and we do believe that it's the oldest house in the village of Bronxville. I have to also confess that my mother was, had her sly aspects to her. She loved to show the house off, and she had 3rd graders and brownies and Girl Scouts and occasional Cub Scouts come up to the house and would take them through the house. And my wife was just telling me that she met a woman in Bronxville just last week who said that she remembered as a kid coming to the house and being given the grand tour, and then being told what was a falsehood, namely that George Washington lived in that house. And that George Washington actually came down from the bedroom up on the 2nd floor. There's sort of a paneled wall with 2 fireplaces, and you can't really see the door. Anyway, according to Mother, George came out that exit, past the fireplaces, and escaped the British in October of 1776. We know that can't be true because we've actually looked at the land records. I actually have to give Eloise Morgan credit for tracking this down. But the land records clearly show that that house, the property on which that house was built, was acquired in 1812 by Abijah Morgan, who is also a very interesting man in Eastchester, one of Eastchester's first supervisors, and responsible in a lot of ways, not Alexander Masterton's equal, but nevertheless important to the marble industry. He actually was the first co-owner of one of the quarries that he acquired in 1824. In any event, the house, Mother really worked and preserved that house from 1937 until her death in 2000. And what she did at the end of her life, I think, is interesting and very community-minded. She gave the house by testamentary gift to the Bronxville Historical Conservancy. And the Conservancy took the house, and then, as Mother wished, they sold it. They didn't try and turn it into a museum, because Mother was familiar with some houses that people had tried to make to museums that just failed. But it was sold subject to restrictive provisions that ensure its perpetuity as the house that it is. And anyway, the house was sold in 2001, and I'm happy to say that today the house looks better than ever. It was acquired about 4 years ago by this family that had really done a nice job of restoring it very, very nicely. And you can see it very easily from Pondfield Road and White Plains Road. In fact, I brought tonight, you're too far away, but one of the things the Eastchester 350th organization did was underwrite an exhibit of structures in Eastchester that have some significance to the marble industry. And we got our neighbor Larry Lee to do some wonderful photographs of the surviving marble buildings, both in Manhattan, one in Charleston, and in Tuckahoe, including the two Catholic churches, of course, and then the marble schoolhouse that was built in 1835. Anyway, the exhibit included a photograph of Mother's house, which I think is a good one. Anyway, this book is really a rare edition. Every copy is worth about $10,000. There were only, Larry found the most expensive printer in the world to do this. And we could only afford, I think we bought, how many copies did we buy? 20 copies, can you remember? Anyway, they're in the local libraries, the school libraries, and the town and the village libraries. So you can go see there the photograph of the house, as well as many of the marble buildings in the town and outside the town. And I can say also that Mother's Gift is used continually, the income from it, for projects, including the Conservancy right now is underwriting a portion of the cost of the restoration of the street signs in the village of Bronxville, as they looked 25 years ago before they became corrupted with simple little signs. So it's a nice thought for me, and I think for the community.
Do the present owners ever open the house for a walkthrough?
They have no obligation to, and I'm sure in time we'll do it. I actually went in with my sister 6 months ago and was with their consent, and they were glad to have us come through. That house was on the Bronxville house tour. I think it was the first one we did in 1998, 1999. And I'm sure it'll be on the Conservancy house tour again, perhaps even this year or next year.
Thank you, Bob. Robert Riggs was co-chairman, chairperson along with Linda Laird, and it was of the 350th anniversary of the town of Eastchester. And Bob, we had so much fun. Thank you for the great job that you did. We have one more speaker tonight, and after the 350th was over, I started to resume writing my articles for the local newspaper. And when we wrote Out of the Wilderness, Eloise and I made a decision. Who do we pick after 1945? How are we to decide who we will pick and who we will not pick? So Eloise and I decided It had to be somebody who died in the service of the community or the country, or the first minority, the first woman to do things. But there were two people who I felt left out. One was Frida Riggs, and the other was Carmela Vaccaro. Last summer, I sat down with Les and his wife and Donato, and I had the best night's sleep I've had in 10 years. Because Donato and Les were telling me about their wonderful, Donato's grandmother and Les's mother, and her wonderful gift. So Donato, will you tell us about Carmela, your grandma?
I just wanted to say the speakers before me did a wonderful job, and I'm truly impressed about the fact that they memorized so much of their stuff, and I feel ashamed to say that I'm using cards. Sorry.
I use cards too.
Next time I do this, I have to memorize everything, but I'm really happy to be here. And I just want to say that the entire Vaccaro family is really deeply honored to be having our grandmother, Carmela Vaccaro, acknowledged in this way as one of the famous women in Eastchester history. And it's fitting that we're here, that we're being acknowledged this year, because it was 110 years ago, in fact, that our family came to America, and it was actually Carmela Vaccaro's husband, Donato's brother, Antonio, who came here in 2010 by way of Ellis Island, as immigrants did at the time. And he started essentially what ultimately became one of the largest and longest standing families in Westchester. It was Antonio who came in 110 years ago. And then his brother, Donato, came over the next year. And what happened was, Donato, this is a fun part of the story that I just learned a couple of years ago, is that he first went to Mulberry Street in New York City, and that was sort of a place that Italians sort of went when they first came to New York. But his brother Antonio said, "No way, you can't be on Mulberry Street. It's dangerous there. You have to come up to Eastchester. It's safe up here." And I thought that was really a fun part of my learning about my family history. That even way back then, it was concern that if you were in the city, maybe it wasn't as safe, and that you came up to the suburbs to be safe. So it was my great uncle Tony that convinced Donato to come up here, and it was their hard work and dedication that allowed them to be up in the more comfortable suburbs of the city. And it's essentially what happened was that Donato then went back to Italy. Bonefero was the town that they came from, and he brought his wife Carmela and their 6 children. Actually, a couple of children, and they ultimately had 6 children. At the time, according to my elders and my grandmother Carmela would have said this, Eastchester was very close to the community of families, many of them, who had emigrated from Italy to Eastchester and Tuckahoe. It's well known that these communities have a strong foundation in Italian heritage and Irish. So for the Vaccaro family, it was certainly an ideal place to put down their roots. They felt like they had this connection with other Italians there. And our elders have fond memories of Eastchester being more country-like, for sure. My grandmother, in fact, raised chickens. There was goats on the property. My uncle has memories of the cows. I think someone else mentioned the cow. In fact, it was less than 100 years ago that there were cows walking up Brook Street. And so it wasn't at all unusual to have a family farm. In fact, I was lucky enough to be born. Actually, my first 4 years were in my grandmother's house. And then ultimately we moved just in her backyard, because my grandmother was kind enough to have her son, my father, live behind her and have a house there. And so I was able to witness my grandmother at a very young age. She was in the garden every day in the warm months. She worked really hard in the garden, like essentially the whole day, it seemed. And she had chickens. That was a real fun part of growing up in Eastchester, believe it or not. There was this long time that you couldn't have chickens, and there's a whole story about chickens these days, but we won't go into that. That's a separate story. Who happens to be my neighbor across the street. But, But no, I actually have really fond memories of growing up with chickens. I remember putting my hand in the cage, and it was really fun. And the other really fond memory about my grandmother was that, on a personal note, was that she was, it was like a stereotypical Italian grandmother. There was always food in the house. Like every time you walked in the house, she was trying to get you to eat. And the smell of pizza was absolutely wonderful. And the cookies, there was always little biscotti. And so that was a really fun time. But what's interesting about being born in 1957 as I was, and just being here this short time, and certainly from my grandmother's time to now, is how dramatically the landscape and culture of Eastchester has changed in such a short time, really. And so I just want to be able to explain to you what values define my grandmother and explain why she's considered so important in the town. First of all, she was a woman of faith. She, I think that probably was what's so important in getting her to come from Italy and come here, and her whole family. The faith was essentially a cornerstone of their, the Catholic Church was the cornerstone of the family's faith, and it was a really important part of their whole family life, and it was what brought them here, and it kept their family together. Education was another really important family value that was shared by my grandmother Carmela, and it was something ultimately conveyed down the line. Whether it was learning a new skill or a trade, or it was the more formal education in the classroom, they really valued education. That was something that was passed on to our family. Many of the Vaccaros went on to college and grad school, etc. Several have, there's a wide range of occupations that stem from Carmela. There's teachers, lawyers, people in corporate America. So there's essentially a whole spectrum of things that happened. And Carmela was a hardworking person. As I was saying, she was always in the garden. She was essentially intent on making sure that the children and her grandchildren were always taken care of. And of course, there was the Vaccaro Shoe Repair. Her husband, Donato, owned the Vaccaro Shoe Repair, which lasted like 80 years in the village of Scarsdale. So although her family came from this very small village in the country 2 hours east of Rome, they were very hardworking, and they were very intent on getting education, and were fostering that among their children. They worked hard to teach themselves English and develop a rapport with folks in this country when they came. And it was funny to see a lot of the parallels between my own family heritage and some of the things that were talked about by the people that came much earlier. And Italians, of course, faced discrimination as the Irish did, and I know that was something that they were struggled with. You kind of heard that, the stories. I didn't feel that so much as in my generation, but I think that I heard the stories, and I knew that was something that they felt. One of the reasons that I'm here talking about my grandmother and that she is considered so important in the history of Eastchester is that she was a very generous person, and there was this history of volunteerism in our family. I think Bob was mentioning about his mom, and that there was 100 years of. Your mom was generous because she gave the house to the village of Bronxville, and someone else mentioned that Amy Dusenberry had 100 years of caring in their family. And I think it's funny to hear those stories and how those are parallels with my own grandmother. Because, in fact, Carmela's husband, Donato, along with his brother Antonio, started the Eastchester Italian American Club that exists today. And now it's more of a sort of a fun social club. But in fact, when it first started, it was really instrumental in helping the Italian immigrants that came to Eastchester to learn English, to become acculturated. They were very intent on being to be American citizens. And that was really helpful in making that happen. And it still exists today. And they have, of course, they're doing really important things, including sponsoring scholarships for kids. So I don't want to discount what's happening, excuse me. But I just wanted to emphasize the importance of it early on, especially. So for more than 100 years, Carmela, was the beginning of it, but she really encouraged and fostered this idea of volunteerism in our family. And it still goes on today, including my sister Teresa, who's on the council. There's just this running theme that happened all the time. But it was actually Carmela's generosity that most defined her contributions to the town of Eastchester. In 1950, Carmela offered to, she essentially donated the property that's now called Cooper's Field, and it actually has been renamed Vaccaro Park. But in 1950, the town actually was willing to pay her $68,000, which was a pretty decent sum of money then. And actually what happened was that she took a tiny fraction of that, and basically donated the property at Cooper Field to the town of Eastchester. And of course, the town accepted, and the land became known as Cooper Field. In the 1970s, the closing of Cooper School across the street left the field in danger of being developed, and realtors actually would put it worth at least $2 million today. But in 1980, the town officials negotiated an agreement to rent the property from the school district for $1 a year, which essentially prevented houses from being built there. And it was really Carmela Vaccaro's intent to have the field be open land for children to play. She was very fond of children, and in fact, if you go there today, if you go to the park today, there's a plaque there at the front gate where she was known to say that she loved to hear the sounds of children's voices. And I distinctly remember that, like I remember being, because our home is where I grew up, and where she had her house was essentially adjacent to the park. And she always enjoyed hearing the kids in the field, as we all did. It was just a fun part of living next to a field, just to be able to hear all the voices. So ultimately, Carmela and Donato produced 43 grandchildren and more than 100 great-grandchildren. Excuse me, there's probably more. It goes beyond that. But I just want to thank you.
43 grandchildren, how many great-grandchildren?
Well, it actually became hard to count, frankly. We just decided it's more than 100. No, because that's like, it's hard to count because some are adopted, some passed away. It's like, it depends how you count it, but there's more than 100. And so 110 years later, it's just this large, long-standing family. And it was really Carmela that was so generous, and her generosity and her important values that she conveyed that makes her such an important person. And thank you so much for listening.
I have flowers for the great actresses tonight. Bob, you only get one.
I don't deserve any.
Well, actually, you're getting Becca's because she left already. And Donato, you get one too. Do you guys have any questions of any of the actresses or me? Or I know we've covered a lot in the last hour. I am so happy that this went so well. And you guys are great. Any questions about anything that went on?
Can you do it again next year?
Who asked that? That's a perfect question. I would. Oh, you got it.
I got one.
Oh, I'm sorry. You don't take two. I would like to do this again, but I feel very uncomfortable being the only person selecting. I have a list of 10 people, and there must be more, but I would love to get people from different historical organizations to say who are the next 6 people we're going to honor, because it shouldn't just be one person picking that group. I would definitely want to do it again. And I have my list of 10, but there must be more. But, you know, these people should span the entire history and cover all the different groups. And the wonderful thing about the 350th is we've learned so much new. And even after our book, Out of the Wilderness, was published, we're learning new things every day. And with the prophets, and Bob, you'll explain it better than me, Eloise Morgan has a wonderful newspaper project that she's done where on the internet are a number of local newspapers, so
8 of them.
8 of them, and we're actually, so there's so much new we can learn. Any other questions? Thank you you can come up and ask us personally, but thank you very much for coming.